Hello, and welcome back to Princess Origin Stories, a special episode of Princess State of Mind. I'm Faith Moore. This is the show where we take a look at the fairy tales behind the Disney princess movies and examine their symbolism, history, and relevance to the movies they inspire. Today's episode is all about Cinderella. Cinderella is arguably the most iconic fairy tale princess. Nearly every culture in the world has a Cinderella story. More than 500 versions of the narrative have been documented in Europe alone, with its roots dating as far back as the 9th century. There's something about this story that speaks to us. All of us. One common misconception about Disney's Cinderella is that it's based on the version recorded by the Brothers Grimm. It isn't. The Brothers Grimm version is pretty famous because of how gory it is. The stepsisters cut off pieces of their feet to try to fit them in the slipper and end up with their eyes gouged out at the end as punishment. This version features in other more modern productions like Stephen Sondheim's Into the Woods, but it's not the inspiration for the Disney movie. Thank goodness. Disney's inspiration came from a different source altogether, Charles Perrault. Perrault was a French author in the 1600s and is frequently credited with helping to create the genre of fairy tale. His writing was influenced by folk tales, and many of his retellings influenced the Brothers Grimm 100 or so years later. Perrault's version of Cinderella is called Cinderella or The Little Glass Slipper, and can most easily be found in Andrew Lang's collection of fairy tales, The Blue Fairy Book. As I did with Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, I'm going to read Charles Perrault's version of Cinderella in its entirety. If you'd rather skip this part, check the description of this video for the correct timestamp. If you're sticking with me, let's get started. Cinderella, or The Little Glass Slipper. Once there was a gentleman who married for his second wife the proudest and most haughty woman that was ever seen. She had, by a former husband, 2 daughters of her own humor who were indeed exactly like her in all things. He had likewise by another wife a young daughter, but of unparalleled goodness and sweetness of temper, which she took from her mother, who was the best creature in the world. No sooner were the ceremonies of the wedding over, but the mother-in-law began to show herself in her true colors. She could not bear the good qualities of this pretty girl, and the less because they made her own daughters appear the more odious. She employed her in the meanest work of the house. She scoured the dishes, tables, etc., and scrubbed Madam's chamber and those of Mrs. her daughters. She lay up in a sorry garret, upon a wretched straw bed, while her sisters lay in fine rooms, with floors all inlaid upon beds of the very newest fashion, and where they had looking-glasses so large that they might see themselves in their full length from head to foot. The poor girl bore all patiently, and dared not tell her father, who would have rattled her off, for his wife governed him entirely. When she had done her work, she used to go into the chimney corner and sit down among the cinders and ashes, which made her commonly be called Cinder Wench. But the youngest, who was not so rude and uncivil as the eldest, called her Cinderella. However, Cinderella, notwithstanding her mean apparel, was 100 times handsomer than her sisters, though they were always dressed very richly. It happened that the king's son gave a ball and invited all persons of fashion to it. Our young misses were also invited, for they cut a very grand figure among the quality. They were mightily delighted at this invitation, and wonderfully busy in choosing out such gowns, petticoats, and head-clothes as might become them. This was a new trouble to Cinderella, for it was she who ironed the sisters' linen and plaited their ruffles. They talked all day long of nothing but how they should be dressed. "For my part," said the eldest, "I will wear my red velvet suit with French trimming." "And I," said the youngest, "shall have my usual petticoat, but then, to make amends for that, I will put on my gold-flowered manteau and my diamond stomacher, which is far from being the most ordinary one in the world." They sent for the best tire-woman they could to make up their headdresses and adjust their double pinners. And they had their red brushes and patches from Mademoiselle de la Poche. Cinderella was likewise called up to them to be consulted in all these matters, for she had excellent notions, and advised them always for the best, nay, and offered her services to dress their heads, which they were very willing she should do. As she was doing this, they said to her, "Cinderella, would you not be glad to go to the ball?" "Alas," said she, "you only jeer me. It is not for such as I to go thither." "Thou art in the right of it," replied they. "It would make the people laugh to see a cinder wench at the ball." Anyone but Cinderella would have dressed their heads awry, but she was very good, and dressed them perfectly well. They were almost 2 days without eating, so much were they transported with joy. They broke above a dozen laces in trying to be laced up close, that they might have a fine, slender shape. And they were continually at their looking-glass. At last the happy day came. They went to court, and Cinderella followed them with her eyes as long as she could, and when she had lost sight of them, she fell a-crying. Her godmother, who saw her all in tears, asked her what was the matter. I wish I could. She was not able to speak the rest, being interrupted by her tears and sobbing. This godmother of hers, who was a fairy, said to her, "Thou wishest thou couldst go to the ball. Is that not so?" "Yes," cried Cinderella with a great sigh. "Well," said her godmother, "be but a good girl, and I will contrive that thou shalt go." Then she took her into her bedchamber and said to her, "Run into the garden and bring me a pumpkin." Cinderella went immediately to gather the finest she could get and brought it to her godmother, not being able to imagine how this pumpkin could make her go to the ball. Her godmother scooped out all the inside of it, having left nothing but the rind, which done, she struck it with her wand, and the pumpkin was instantly turned into a fine coach, gilded all over with gold. She then went to look into her mouse trap, where she found 6 mice, all alive, and ordered Cinderella to lift up a little the trap door, when, giving each mouse as it went out a little tap with her wand, the mouse was that moment turned into a fine horse, which altogether made a very fine set of 6 horses of a beautiful mouse-colored dapple gray. Being at a loss for a coachman, "I will go and see," said Cinderella, "if there is never a rat in the rat trap. We may make a coachman of him." "Thou art in the right," replied her godmother. "Go and look." Cinderella brought her trap to her, and in it there were 3 huge rats. The fairy made choice of one of the 3, which had the largest beard, and having touched him with her wand, he was turned into a fat, jolly coachman who had the smartest whiskers eyes ever beheld. After that, she said to her, "Go again into the garden, and you will find 6 lizards behind the watering pot. Bring them to me." She had no sooner done so, but her godmother turned them into 6 footmen, who skipped up immediately behind the coach, with their liveries all bedaubed with gold and silver, and clung as close behind each other as if they had done nothing else their whole lives. The fairy then said to Cinderella, "Well, you see here an equipage fit to go to the ball with. Are you not pleased with it?" "Oh, yes," cried she, "but must I go thither as I am in these nasty rags?" Her godmother only just touched her with her wand, and at the same instant her clothes were turned into cloth of gold and silver, all beset with jewels. This done, she gave her a pair of glass slippers, the prettiest in the whole world. Being thus decked out, she got up into her coach, but her godmother, above all things, commanded her not to stay till after midnight, telling her at the same time that if she stayed 1 moment longer, the coach would be a pumpkin again, her horses mice, her coachman a rat, her footmen lizards, and her clothes become just as they were before. She promised her godmother she would not fail of leaving the ball before midnight, and then away she drives, scarce able to contain herself for joy. The king's son, who was told that a great princess whom nobody knew was come, ran out to receive her. He gave her his hand, and she alighted out of the coach, and led her into the ball among all the company. There was immediately a profound silence. They left off dancing, and the violins ceased to play. So attentive was everyone to contemplate the singular beauties of the unknown newcomer. Nothing was then heard but a confused noise of, "Ha, how handsome she is! Ha, how handsome she is!" The king himself, old as he was, could not help watching her and telling the queen softly that it was a long time since he had seen so beautiful and lovely a creature. All the ladies were busied in considering her clothes and headdress, that they might have some made next day after the same pattern, provided they could meet with such fine material and as able hands to make them. The king's son conducted her to the most honorable seat, and afterward took her out to dance with him. She danced so very gracefully that they all more and more admired her. A fine collation was served up, whereof the young prince ate not a morsel, so intently was he busied in gazing on her. She went and sat down by her sisters, showing them 1,000 civilities, giving them part of the oranges and citrons which the prince had presented her with, which very much surprised them, for they did not know her. While Cinderella was thus amusing her sisters, she heard the clock strike 11 3/4, whereupon she immediately made a courtesy to the company and hastened away as fast as she could. When she got home, she ran to seek out her godmother, and after having thanked her, she said she could not but heartily wish she might go the next day to the ball, because the king's son had desired her. As she was eagerly telling her godmother whatever had passed at the ball, her 2 sisters knocked at the door, which Cinderella ran and opened. "How long you have stayed," she cried, gaping, rubbing her eyes, and stretching herself as if she had been just wakened out of her sleep. She had not, however, any manner of inclination to sleep, since they went from home. "If thou hadst been at the ball," said one of the sisters, "thou wouldst not have been tired with it. There came thither the finest princess, the most beautiful ever was seen with mortal eyes. She showed us 1,000 civilities, and gave us oranges and citrons." Cinderella seemed very indifferent in the matter. Indeed, she asked them the name of the princess, but they told her they did not know it, and that the king's son was very uneasy on her account, and would give all the world to know who she was. At this, Cinderella smiled, replied, "She must then be very beautiful indeed. How happy you have been! Could not I see her? Ah, dear Miss Charlotte, do lend me your yellow suit of clothes, which you wear every day." "Ay, to be sure," cried Miss Charlotte. "Lend my clothes to a dirty cinder wench as thou art? I should be a fool." Cinderella, indeed, expected well such an answer, and was very glad of the refusal, for she would have been sadly put to it if her sister had lent her what she asked for, jestingly. The next day the 2 sisters were at the ball, and so was Cinderella, but dressed more magnificently than before. The king's son was always by her, and never ceased his compliments and kind speeches to her, to whom all this was so far from being tiresome that she quite forgot what her godmother had recommended to her, so that she at last counted the clock striking 12, when she took it to be no more than 11. She then rose up and fled as nimble as a deer. The prince followed, but could not overtake her. She left behind one of her glass slippers, which the prince took up most carefully. She got home, but quite out of breath, and in her nasty old clothes, having nothing left her of all her finery but one of the little slippers. Fellow to that she dropped. The guards at the palace gate were asked if they had not seen a princess go out. They said they had seen nobody go out but a young girl very meanly dressed, who had more than the air of a poor country wench than a gentleman. When the 2 sisters returned from the ball, Cinderella asked them if they had been well diverted, and if the fine lady had been there. They told her, yes, but that she hurried away immediately when it struck 12, and with so much haste that she dropped one of her little glass slippers, the prettiest in the world, which the king's son had taken up, that he had done nothing but look at her all the time at the ball, and that most certainly he was very much in love with the beautiful person who owned the glass slipper. What they said was very true, for a few days after the king's son caused it to be proclaimed by sound of trumpet that he would marry her whose foot the slipper would just fit. They whom he employed began to try it upon the princesses, then the duchesses, and all the court, but in vain. It was brought to the 2 sisters, who did all they possibly could to thrust their foot into the slipper, but they could not effect it. Cinderella, who saw all this and knew her slipper, said to them, laughing, "Let me see if it will not fit me." Her sisters burst out a-laughing and began to banter her. The gentleman who was sent to try the slipper looked earnestly at Cinderella, and, finding her very handsome, said it was but just that she should try, and that he had orders to let everyone make a trial. He obliged Cinderella to sit down, and putting the slipper to her foot, he found it went on very easily, and fitted her as if it had been made of wax. The astonishment her two sisters were in was excessively great, but still abundantly greater when Cinderella pulled out of her pocket the other slipper and put it on her foot. Thereupon in came her godmother, who, having touched her with her wand, Cinderella's clothes, made them richer and more magnificent than any of those she had before. And now her two sisters found her to be that fine, beautiful lady whom they had seen at the ball. They threw themselves at her feet to beg pardon for all the ill treatment they had made her undergo. Cinderella took them up, and, as she embraced them, cried that she forgave them with all her heart and desired them always to love her. She was conducted to the young prince, dressed as she was. He thought her more charming than ever, and a few days after married her. Cinderella, who was no less good than beautiful, gave her two sisters lodgings in the palace, and that very same day matched them with two great lords of the court. So, Disney's Cinderella is very clearly based on this version of the story and not the Brothers Grimm version. But as I discuss in my book, Disney's version has an added Christian layer that's not in the original. So Perrault's version, then, is like the skeleton of Disney's version, the bare bones. But that doesn't mean there's nothing to recommend it. What fascinates me about Perrault's fairy tale is what it has to say about inner and outer beauty. It has ties, I think, to the themes of Beauty and the Beast, and it also puts the lie to the feminist idea that fairy tale princesses are all about outer beauty. In the language of fairy tales, good people are often beautiful, and bad people are often ugly. This is not, as many critics want us to believe, because fairy tales promote the idea that only beautiful people are good. It's the opposite. It's a kind of shorthand that helps us understand something about a character very quickly within a short tale. Outer beauty signals inner beauty, not the other way around. But this focus on beauty also allows for a lot of delicious symbolic shenanigans. In Beauty and the Beast, which we'll cover more fully in episode 5, the whole beauty equals good thing gets messed around with quite a bit, so that you've got handsome characters who are evil, ugly characters who are good, and a push to turn everyone back to the correct fairy tale versions of themselves. Good should be beautiful, evil ugly. The key to understanding Cinderella rests in how the characters react to beauty, rather than whether or not they look beautiful themselves, and in the interplay, as in Beauty and the Beast, between inner and outer beauty. To the stepmother and stepsisters, outer beauty is everything. The stepsisters have enormous mirrors in their room to look at themselves day and night. Remind you of anyone, by the way? The stepmother hates Cinderella because Cinderella's goodness makes the stepsister's pride and haughtiness more apparent, so she forces her to do manual labor and sleep in the cinders. It's Cinderella's inner beauty that the stepmother can't stand, because it reveals the fact that the stepsister's outer beauty isn't really enough. But to punish her, the stepmother makes Cinderella ugly on the outside. This seems like a non sequitur, but it sort of works for the stepfamily, because this is a world in which outer beauty is seen as indicative of goodness. Just look at what happens later when Cinderella enters the ball. Her fancy clothes and hair and shoes make her the most sought-after guest, but all that finery is borrowed. Worse than borrowed, it'll totally disappear at midnight, and yet Cinderella is still the maiden most worthy of the prince, even without all that. The entire point of this story is that outer beauty does not mean inner beauty, and that inner beauty is what's really important. To further illustrate that this world is one in which outer beauty is appreciated, take a look at who is invited to the ball. Ladies of fashion. Not, as the Disney version changed it to, all the eligible maidens. Ladies of fashion. You've got to look nice or you can't come. What's interesting, though, is that the stepsisters trust Cinderella's fashion advice implicitly. So again, we've got Cinderella, who is basically ugly on the outside, even though she's not really, as we'll see when she gets the Ultimate Extreme Makeover Fairy Tale Edition, who has within her the information she'd need in order to be beautiful. This is the point. The stepsisters' beauty is only skin deep. They have the fancy clothes, but they aren't good people. Cinderella is beautiful where it matters, inside, but she doesn't have the fancy clothes to signal that to people, so she's overlooked. As an aside, did you notice how the stepsisters kept breaking their laces in an effort to tie themselves tighter and tighter into their clothes? Remind you of anything? Go back to episode 1 and take a look at what the evil queen uses to try to kill Snow White the first time. Anyway, Much like in Disney's Beauty and the Beast, this is a world, or a dull provincial town, if you will, where people form opinions about each other based on their external finery, not their internal beauty. But this is not an indication of what we, the audience, ought to think too. It's completely the opposite. We, along with the step family, are meant to learn that external beauty doesn't matter at all if you don't have integrity, honesty, and heart. Cinderella's fairy godmother just sort of randomly appears out of nowhere. Almost as though, godlike, she was there all along, to validate Cinderella's goodness in this world of external beauty. She takes the trappings of Cinderella's everyday life and elevates them to royal stature. And she clothes Cinderella in the finest gown and jewels because she, Cinderella, is the finest glittering example of inner beauty. The mundane becomes magical. Cinderella's life, which has been good enough for her, which she has borne with fortitude and grace, goes with her to the ball. Just like in the Disney movie, the fairy godmother transforms Cinderella so that her inner beauty is made visible on the outside. And in the fairy tale, this is even more apparent since outer beauty is everyone else's rubric for judging people, so Cinderella gets to be the fairest of them all. The point here is not how wonderful outer beauty is. The point is that Cinderella's beauty, her inner beauty, is what really matters, but she lives in a world where everyone is measured by their outer beauty. So in order to prove to everyone how special Cinderella really is, the fairy godmother makes her the most beautifully dressed woman at the ball. But, all these beautiful things don't last because they're not real. They're just there to show us, and everyone in the story, what sort of beauty is really important. They disappear at midnight, but her inner beauty is with her forever. At the ball, Cinderella is kind to her stepsisters, who don't recognize her since she looks totally different and looks are all they care about, and continues to be exactly what she's always been, beautiful on the inside. It's important to note that the prince and Cinderella really do seem to fall in love with each other over the course of the 2 balls that Cinderella attends. Cinderella is eager to be with him, and he is very eager to find her once she's gone. The story also makes a point of telling us that the prince does nothing but look at Cinderella through the whole ball, so the idea that he wouldn't recognize her again if he saw her doesn't really ring true. That's not why he's got to try the slipper on everybody. Of all the magical things the fairy godmother gives Cinderella, the slippers are the only things that don't disappear at midnight, just like in the Disney movie. And just like in the Disney movie, this matters. The slippers represent Cinderella's true self, the version of her that doesn't need to be dressed up in fancy clothes to get someone's attention. Her inner beauty, goodness, and heart. And that's why they fit only her. Even though lots of people in the kingdom probably have a similar shoe size. And that's why the prince uses it to find his mysterious princess. It doesn't matter to him what she looks like on the outside, so the shoe ensures that even if it turns out she's really a scullery maid all dressed in rags, he'll find her. The prince's servant looks carefully at Cinderella and realizes that under all the dirt, she's actually very beautiful and therefore ought to try on the shoe. The servant is operating within this world of outer beauty, but his reaction is metaphorically apt. Underneath the ragged exterior, Cinderella has a heart of gold. When it turns out the slipper fits her, the fairy godmother reveals that she's the woman from the ball, and the stepsisters, still focused on outer beauty, suddenly apologize to her. When they see her dressed up like a princess, they realize that they must have been underestimating her the whole time. It's not quite the total reversal we want from them. They're still operating within their incorrect philosophy, but they come to understand the error of their ways within their limited worldview. And because she is who she is, Cinderella forgives them. So, Charles Perrault's version of Cinderella doesn't have Disney's Christian overlay, but it does have a lot to say about beauty and what kind of beauty is important. Contrary to popular belief, the story of Cinderella, even in Perrault's version, isn't about shoes and a dress. It's a commentary on how we view and judge each other, and a lesson about what kind of beauty is most important. Personally, I think it sends a really great message. Well, that brings us to the end of this episode of Princess Origin Stories, a special episode of Princess State of Mind. Next time, we'll be talking about Sleeping Beauty, so don't forget to subscribe to this channel and ring the little bell so you don't miss anything. If you like this video, please feel free to share it with your friends. And if you have questions or comments about any of the things I said in this video, feel free to reach out to me via Twitter, Facebook, or via the contact page on my website. Thanks so much for watching Princess Origin Stories, a special episode of Princess State of Mind. I'm Faith Moore. I'll see you next time.